Good morning. Thank you guys for coming. As the session describes and in the description, I'm going to be talking about CodeSite Studio. It's a third-party tool from Ray Software, my company. I'm Ray Konopka, so I get to tell you all about it. Before I get into CodeSite Studio's features, I do want to basically explain to everyone that if you're using RAD Studio XE or later, so XE, XE2, XE3, they all do come with CodeSite Express. And I don't know if you have had a chance to work with that or not. That's fine. I'm going to introduce CodeSite Express a little bit, and then we'll talk about what additional features and capabilities there are in the Studio version. So to start, first and foremost, what is CodeSite? And it's an advanced logging and debugging system. And it's been around since 1998, and we've continued to support Delphi and C++ Builder, and including Visual Studio for .NET development and so forth for many years. What's interesting about it, and I'm going to say unique, because it's built on a technique that developers have been using ever since we write software. It's being able to capture what's going on in your code at some given point in time. And I always like asking developers when I talk for the first time about it is, have you ever put a show message in your code? Okay, we've all done that. We've gotten to some point in our code and we type in show message to show us some value, and which is great. And if what we want to think about is, why do we do that? Why do we have to put a show message in there? Well, the breakpoint, if we set a breakpoint, we may not actually see the data because the optimizing compiler has pushed it onto the registers. We don't see it anymore. We still need that information though. We know it's not great, and if we're not using a show message, we're writing it to the forms label, or we're putting it into the caption or some other way. Two main flaws with this approach. One is we're actually changing the behavior of our code. We're introducing another form, another window. There's focus changes. That's going to cause other events to fire when that message comes up. And if you're doing data validation, that may introduce a series of steps that's not really duplicating the problem. The second major flaw in that is that once you click OK, you've lost that data. There's no record of it. You don't have how did I get to this point? Another example I like to use, because we've all had this, is we run our code and we get an access violation. And what happens? The IDE jumps in. If we're running it in the debugger and you click OK, it goes into the IDE and it shows you the line. Of course, you can't do anything at that point because the stack's unwound and there's nothing to inspect. So what do? We set a breakpoint before the line. We rerun the program, duplicate it, and now we start to check what was the next line doing. And it's usually some object is nil, and we're getting an access violation, which is fine, but the real problem is, why is it nil? Was it nil because some other code freed it and we didn't expect it to, or was the object never created to begin with? It's getting a historical record of what's going on is what's valuable. And CodeSite makes it very easy to do that. And so I'm going to basically spend the rest of the session talking about the different ways that we can get different types of data with respect to our objects, with respect to the system, and so forth, and capture that and then be able to analyze it. And the whole point of it is to track down and isolate problems that you may have in your code more quickly. The faster we can locate where the problem is, you can fix it and move on. What's also nice about CodeSite is that it's not tied to one particular area of development. It's not just for debugging. The same tool, the same logging, the same classes can all be used from development all the way through testing, your QA engineers, your even inside of unit testing, all the way to deployment out to your customers, because most of we do our debugging and our testing and everything's working fine. Now the customer's having some sort of problem. Wouldn't it be great to get the same type of information? And CodeSite makes it very easy to do that. So some key features. We've all probably have seen or have used logging tools at some point, even something as simple as output debug string, which is built into Windows. They all have one common approach, is that they pretty much provide a function that you can capture a string. So whatever you want to record, you convert all your data to some string format and then send it out to some buffer. And the buffer is typically either a text file, flat text file, or it could be something as simple as just a list box, and you just get a dump of data. CodeSite is different in that we use actual classes, instances of a CodeSite logger class that give us all kinds of methods to call to capture information. So we try to help you out capturing things, but we make it very easy and flexible to move this data around to where it makes the most sense. Also key in this is that we don't display any message boxes. We're not changing the flow of your application. They're lightweight, so you can run it and it gets recorded in the background and we can go back and analyze that, but you can also look at it live. So as your application's running, you can see the logging take place. We can easily capture everything from a simple data element as an integer, a string of course, all the way to complex objects of your own doing. So objects that you have, custom objects, we can record all the properties of those and store them as a single entry into the log. And so we'll look at several examples of all of that. Another distinguishing feature in CodeSite is this idea of grouping logging information by categories. In a traditional logging solution, and this is the same thing as with the trace in .NET and other logging types of functions, is you have a log level. And usually it's 1 to 4, and you set the log level for your app to some value. And really what it means is every message that you write out to the log has an associated level with it. And if your log level of that message is greater than or equal to the log level for the app, then it goes out to the output. Otherwise it's ignored. The problem with that approach is that oftentimes we don't have enough granularity for the area we're trying to work on. We've all been, large applications. You've got multiple modules. You might have a printing module, or a customer acquisition module, data entry, and so forth. You might be doing remote communication, and you want to be able to isolate your logging to one particular area. Log levels don't allow you to do that. It's across the board. Categories are our way of accomplishing that, and I'll spend a lot of time talking about how you set those up. It's very simple, but very effective when it comes to the analysis. Lots of flexibility in the way we configure the system and being able to capture the data where we want and how often, and have special tools to analyze it. And that's probably the biggest difference from any logging solutions out there, is that we don't just give you the ability to capture the data, we provide tools to actually investigate, to analyze and understand what's going on. So let me go through and stop the slides for the moment and actually just show what CodeSite's all about. And at this point I'm going to start with the CodeSite Express functionality, and once we start doing the studio version, I'll explain that. So I'm just going to create a simple executable to start with, and let me drop a button just to get something going. And what I always like having developers when they first start using the product is whenever you think you want to do a show message, send the data to CodeSite instead, and you'll quickly learn to start sending it all the time. So I'm going to add in the CodeSite logging unit. So all of the functionality that you need to capture data is inside of this one unit. And after installing it, it gets put onto the path. It is component-based, but you don't need to use components. You don't have to drop it on. Just add the unit to your logging, or add the CodeSite logging unit to your users clause, and you now have access to the core functionality. By default, there is a built-in logger that you immediately have access to. And the logger is an instance of one of the classes that we can use to send data. And so it's called, simply enough, CodeSite. It's very similar in concept to the application object whenever you use a form. So you get the application object, you can start making method calls on it. So just to get very simply started, let me go ahead and run this. Save off my file. And I'll go and click my button. And the first time that it comes up, there's a couple things going on. I'll rearrange all of this here. And this, right now, what I'm looking at is the CodeSite viewer, the live viewer in particular. And then there's another tool that popped up in here called the CodeSite dispatcher. And the dispatcher is I'll talk more about this as we move forward, but it's a core feature for moving the data around inside of CodeSite. So all of your applications, multiple instances, multiple apps can all take their data, they capture the information, and then they'll move it to somewhere else to actually store it into either a log file or the live viewer. The live viewer is the default because as the development mode, this is what we want to see happen. So as I click on the message, I see the CodeSite message shows up in my viewer. And there's a couple pieces, additional information I want to highlight here. Every message that we capture has pieces of data associated with it. We've got what application it was generated in, what computer it came from, the process ID, and what thread it was in. So you can do CodeSite logging from multiple threaded applications, and I'll have an example in just a few minutes. Of course, everything is date and time stamped, so that we're taking a snapshot of what happened at this point in time, so we can see a record of this as we go forward. So obviously, we're sending out a simple string. Let me go and add some additional data. And we've got methods that capture all kinds. Send is kind of the primary function, and it's overloaded a whole bunch of different ways that we can look at to send different information. The key thing, the reason for this is that we don't want to have to convert our data from its native format into a logging statement. Send it over just like you think it would be. So for example, let me close that down, and I'll send over the height of the form, for example. A lot of times we want to investigate values of our code, and so we can send that. Let me go and add a couple more. I'll do CodeSite send, and then I'll do screen.fonts, for example. And I should actually be using the templates that we've added, that if I do CSS, for example, it'll type in, it expands the template, and you can just type in the one value. So let me do self. And in this case, I'm going to send an instance of this form, which is the method I'm in. So let me go ahead and run this again. And we'll come back, and I click the button, go back to my viewer, and now I've got, okay, there's the height value that I set, shows the 34. Here is the screen fonts on my system, and here are actually all the fonts that are registered. So screen.font is a string list. We do string lists all the time in Delphi. Well, we have an overloaded function that just passes a string list. So whether it's a SQL statement and a query, whether it's the screen fonts list or your own string list instance, you can send it to CodeSite and get a snapshot of what that list looks like at that point in time. The object icon here, and right now these are informational messages, which is the message type. The message content tells me what is in that message, and so the little object indicator tells me I've got name value pairs of properties. So the main form is, the name of it is form 19, that type, and here are all the published properties of that particular object at that point in time. Well, what's really kind of cool is, let's say I change the form a little bit. I move it around, and I record the message again later. I can look at that, and I suppose you could try to compare the two. What changed? That's what we want to find out. Well, just go into the viewer and select the two items. Because they're the same type, it actually shows you what's different between the two objects. So this is part of that analysis that CodeSite gives you. And this is, I'm still talking just CodeSite Express. I haven't shown anything that's not in your RAD Studio version right now. So definitely, we encourage you to get used to trying out this and seeing what we can do with this. So another feature that is very nice to be able to do is group the data in a way that makes sense. Like right now, as I build my log, and I keep looking at, let me unpin this, let me unpin this, so I don't have to keep swapping. As I keep going through, I have just basically a left justified list of data. I know I sent this message, but I don't necessarily know where. And a lot of times, we have dependencies. We have different event handlers and which ones are getting fired when, and we want to be able to see some of that. One of the ways we do that is using what's called the enter method and exit method calls. And so if I type in CodeSite enter method and give it self, just because I know I'm an object, you don't have to, but it's nice when you do that, because it'll tell us what instance it is. And if I type in button one click at the beginning, and if I do the exit for the same one, and go ahead and run this now, when I click the button and look at the viewer, I now have some structure to my code. I see that, oh, I've entered this particular method. I can see the values that were generated in there, and they actually show up into the list, and then I can go and see the close. And of course, I can collapse that down if I want to filter out some of the extra calls and so forth. So by adding those statements in at various points, we can see where we are flowing through our application. And one of the things I'll show in the Studio version is we make that even easier than adding those statements in. So at this point, this is the very basic. There's a whole lot more of content that I'll show shortly, but for now, this is basic live logging. As the developers start to record this, the viewer starts up, everything's getting pushed into there, great. Well, what if I want to save this to a log file? I want to deploy it. I don't necessarily want the live viewer to be popping up on an end user's machine. You can. The live viewer and the various tools are freely redistributable. So if you did want to provide that to your customer to see that, maybe it was a live text session and you wanted to get live data, you could do that. But most of the time you're going to write it to a log file. So the way we do the log file generation is I'm going to build a form create event handler here, and we're going to set some things up. And so there's two basic destinations or endpoints of a CodeSite message. It's going to go from your app, the logger classes, out to some, well, the dispatcher in this case, and then it either goes to the live viewer, which can either be local on your machine or on a remote machine, or it can be to a log file, both on your local machine or to a remote machine. And so what I want to show now is the way we control that is through what's called a CodeSite destination. So let me go ahead and create one in here. And it's T CodeSite, and you can do the helpful hint, so destination. And then if I go into here, so dest equals T CodeSite destination dot create, and yes, it's a self, and then dest, and then what we're going to see is, oh, there already showed up. There's a number of properties that we'll find in here. And the two common ones that the Express version have is the viewer destination, and the log file. The other ones are in the Studio version, and I'll talk about those a bit. But to start, I want to go to a log file. So I need to do destination.log file. And the first thing I'm going to do is set active to true so I don't forget. And we'll see why this is important in a minute. But I'll go back to my log file, and then I need to set a file path. So bear with me for just a second. I'm turning off some of the code. So expression, tooltip symbol, tooltip help. I know what the stuff does. I don't need the help there, so I think that will be good. All right, I'll move my mouse out of the way. Okay, so I'm going to set the file path to the directory of where I want this to be. And you can hard code this value in, but we also have named variables, like you see in the Delphi IDE, $, open paren, and some named symbol that maps to some location. We can do the same thing. One of the common ones is to use $, my docs. And so that's the path that I want to put it in. And actually, I think I have the logs in there. And then we'll do des.log file.file name. And this will be the name of the file. So let's see, edc.csl. All right, and so at this point, I've created, this defines where these messages are go, but I still need to say, okay, who's going to use this destination? I need to get the loggers to be able to reference this. I can do that at the logger level. We haven't really talked about that yet, so I'm going to do it more at the global level and introduce a concept called the CodeSite Manager. and set its default destination to this new destination. The manager, it's a singleton that's available that manages all of your loggers. And so if we want all of our logger instances to use the same destination, we're going to set the default destination property to what we want it to be. By default, it gets set to the viewer. So that's why no matter what logger we create, if we don't change it, it's going to go to the live viewer. Now by assigning it to a log file destination, all of our messages are going to go there instead. And so let me just confirm that I actually do have my logs directory in the right spot where I think it is. I do. There's where we're going to go. So let me go ahead and compile and run this. And what I also want to show is bring up the viewer. So the viewer still has our history of the previous runs. Of course, everything's time-stamped. I'm going to go ahead and click this. And I do have auto scroll set to true in the viewer. So as new messages come in, they become visible. But as I click this, my live viewer doesn't change at all. Well, let's go find where the messages went. So let me close this down. Go back to my Explorer, and inside of the logs directory, there is indeed an EDC file that was just created. Double click on this, and this will start up the CodeSite file viewer. And there's a lot of similarities. They're based on the same code base, but there's different roles in which they play. There's only one live viewer instance that runs at a given time. However, with the file viewer, you might want to look at multiple log files, and you can view those. You can hit refresh to reload them if it's getting written to in the background. So I could have the app still running and writing messages to it. Just do a refresh, the new messages get added into the end. I have all the same code, same capabilities that I do before. So if I inspect the screen fonts, I see all of that in there. I can look at the different properties of the object. Of course, I can toggle what columns I want to show. I can say just take off this and show me the timestamp. I can show it as a timestamp, an absolute value of when it was recorded, or the difference between the previous message. So you can, most of the time it'll be less than, a couple milliseconds. Although, if it's a longer gap, then you'll see the difference in there. So we can see what that looks like going forward. So it's actually really nice to see what you have big gaps. The other way of looking at this is an offset from the beginning of the log, so you can see how time grows. It all is up to you and how you want to investigate the data there. Let me go ahead and close that down. And so I've got to the log file. Great. Well, you may be wondering, I mentioned that active property over in the log file. The way we have this structured is that we can actually extend this and include other destinations, like set the data to go to both the live viewer and the log file. Do it simultaneously. So by adding the viewer and setting that to active, rerunning my app, what I can see is coming back, and I'm going to get the messages showing up into my live viewer as well as the log file being generated. So it's very powerful to be able to do that. Now, you can also configure these dynamically. You may want to have some setting in your application that turns on the various destination pieces as needed. You can set them up and set the active flag to false. So if I were to do this, I don't have to erase any of the settings. I just turn off that file logging, and then I can turn it back on as needed. So as I mentioned before, there's lots of different ways to customize all of this. All right, let me bring back, let me see what I wanted to do, multiple loggers is the next one. So let me switch back to this, and I'm going to bring up a pre-built app that's going to help go through some of these more quickly rather than see me type everything. I'm going to start up a message generator, and the message generator is available on our website. It's a great way to just see how things work and examples of what we can record. And so let me bring up my viewer, and I'm going to go ahead and clear out the log because we're going to start over basically. And this is going to help us illustrate a lot of the other features that are available and what we can capture. And eventually we're going to get to talking about multiple loggers for that log level type of issue where we want to isolate areas of our code to analyze the data. So I had mentioned briefly that you have informational message, you have a message type. And so we want to be able to highlight certain messages. You know, there's informational, there may be notes, we have reminder capabilities, error messages, exceptions come in a certain way that can be recorded so that we can quickly highlight those and find them. You have different priority levels and so forth. The data on the right icon gives us the content. We've already seen the string list version. These are just text-based message context. When I select it, the inspector pane simply shows me, you know, what that same data is. As I move to additional data types, I already showed you the lists that we've got. Color values. If you're doing anything with coloring, painting problems, you want to make sure you're setting the right colors in the alpha channels, send it to CodeSite and it gives you a color swatch of what color value that is. And I apologize, this is very washed out today. It's a nice subtle blue on my screen here. That's a little coarse, but we also have the ability to send a text file. So if you have your, you know, an INI file, an XML file, you know, any type of text data that you want to capture, it'll read the file and put it into the log. And so you have a snapshot of what that was. Maybe you've got external queries that users are providing you. Binary data, you want to take a look at a stream or some other representation, you can get a snapshot of what that looks like. Here I'm just taking a binary rep of a bitmap image. I already showed about the objects, and the objects and to be able to compare the two is still part in the Express version. The Studio version also allows you the ability to have collections. And so collections are things like database grid columns or field definitions. You also have the status bar panels. So at the bottom of this form, we've got a little status panel here, which each cell is its own collection item. Well, you just send over the status bars panels, and you get in the inspector pane each instance of the item and then the properties of that item. So one single line statement, and you get all of this data as part of the log. Let's move on to image support. Now we're moving on to data types that are in the Studio version. So basic primitive data types, and including objects and string lists, are there in the Express, but now when we start talking about advanced features, the text file is also in the Studio version. The bitmap and images, so if we're doing any type of recording, we can record a photo, we can stretch that, we can scale it, whatever we want. We can do an application icons. I even capture the window. Wouldn't it be great, your user's having some sort of problem and you're like, what are you working on right now? It's like, oh, nothing. I'm not doing anything special. And if you could capture the screenshot and then put it into your log, you'd have some good information. One of the things we can do is we can expand the inspector to take up the whole screen and get a view of what the desktop looks like. And you can have it in the one-to-one ratio so we see exactly what is going on. I can toggle that back and get to the entire desktop if I want. So if we scale that, I'm capturing my full desktop. Now, I mentioned we can send this data locally or remotely. Realize if you're doing a full desktop screenshot, it's going to be a 24-bit image. Now, we do capture it as a PNG format, so it does get compressed. It's still a lot of data to send that over the network. You can do it, you just want to be aware of that. So these are nice things to be able to have. A lot of times we're dealing with our Windows applications, at least to start. So if you are doing Windows-based and you're not doing a FireMonkey app, you have access to the Win32 functionality. I should also point out that CodeSite does support FireMonkey, so you can use it in your FireMonkey applications as well. Some of the things that we provide is system information, the common things that we constantly want from our customers. What has changed on your system lately? Have you added a new video card? What version of Windows are you running? So there's a simple function to get some core system information and log it into your log. Great thing to put at the beginning of your log. So when your application starts up, what system am I running on? If you use version information in your applications, you can record the version information that's associated with it also into the log. Again, a single line statement captures that information for your reference. So we know what version, what language ID, CodeGen page, and so forth. Accessing the registry. You want to inspect what's going on inside of that registry. Are you getting your settings set the right way? Are they going the right location? Do you have access? Gives you all of that. Memory status gives you some information about the memory manager that's being used in your app. Some window information, it's a little bit low level. This is actually nice for component writers. And why we created CodeSite to begin with was to support the Raised Components product. Back in Delphi 1, up until basically version 3, you loaded your library of components directly into the IDE. And when it's running, if you crashed your component, you brought Delphi down. So it made it very challenging to debug any of that. And that was really what the precursor for why we created CodeSite to begin with, was to be able to have something external capturing what's going on, not making focus changes or causing behavior changes, because we want the IDE to work right, and then go back and be able to see what happened. So we brought Delphi down all the time. You could still bring Delphi down with your components, even though it's a little bit easier and more isolated. Another feature that's nice to have in the Studio version is what we call a checkpoint. And we've all run into situations like this where we've got some sort of loop processing going on in our code, and we're getting an error. It could be an index out of bounds, it could be something. And we don't really get a lot of information, we just get that it's not completing. We might get an exception, but usually it's, okay, well, which one failed? We don't know, because once it unwinds, the index into the loop is gone, so we don't even know how far we're in. So what do? We set a breakpoint, and we hit F9, F9, F9. We count, and then we get the exception, and of course we forgot what count we were. We have to do it again. Instead of going through all of that and trying to think the way the compiler is executing your code, just add a couple statements, run it, regenerate the problem, and then analyze the log to react to it. It's much faster than trying to think like the compiler. So in this example, I've got some list, I'm processing the songs in this list, and when I do so, there's something going on. I know I'm not getting all 27 items, but I also know by simply calling add checkpoint that I only got to item number 9. Okay, now I've got some information that I can use. I can set a data breakpoint for when I'm at item number 9, then go in and step through the code if I want to, which also emphasizes that CodeSite's not a replacement for any of your traditional debugging tools. They're all still are in your toolbox to help you locate problems. Certain things make perfect sense to have the debugger. I want to set a breakpoint, I want to go into the code, I want to change a value, continue on and run, perfectly valid. We want to work with those tools to be able to find where our problems are more quickly. And of course, we're not having the debugger and things like that when we're on our customer's machine. So we want to unify all of that. So checkpoints, very powerful, very cool. Another feature that we have is the ability to have capturing data set values. So record values from any data set descendant, so client data set, for example, or T-table, or whatever tool you're using, DB Express commands. If we have a data set, we can get to the field record or even the full data set itself. And so if I want to look at the current customer record, I can get a name value grid of what those values are. If you really wanted to see the full table, view the full table, and we auto-size everything to show the data that you want. Of course, do not send a million record row over the network in the middle of a database query. Probably not what you want to do. Going to be a lot of data. But for short lookup tables, that's great. We use that all the time to make sure that we've got the right values in there to do our lookups and things. We're dealing with XML files all the time, whether it's XML files or XML data, so forth. We have some built-in support tools to help us with that. The text file version gives us this basic dump of what that XML data looks like. And it could be formatted, or it could be one stream of XML data. And it'd be nice to be able to have a way to visualize that in some different ways. That's where, if we send it over as an XML file or XML data, we actually have our syntax view of the XML data, collapsible nodes, syntax highlighted. You can also switch to the structure view, and it'll actually give you a structure view of what this looks like, the different elements that are made up of it, the tag parameters on each one, and so forth. So if we look at the ingredients, we can see the first ingredient, it's a quantity, it's a box, and what item it is, and so forth. So just, again, different ways that you can do that, and it memorizes what setting that you have. What's nice is that all of them have the same structure, so it's a consistent way of looking at your XML data. Custom data, we've got data structures that we use in our code that don't have RTTI or things in it that we can access. We may want to represent our internal data structure that could be in a tree format, multiple objects, and provide a way to log that data to CodeSite in a single line statement. So with the use of custom formatters, and I don't have the time to go through how you build them, but it's all documented into the help and how you can create those. You create it once, and then your classes use those whenever they want to send data to CodeSite. And there's a little registration that goes in, but I can take, for example, all the controls that are on a form and get a tree view of all of that structured data. I can customize the ownership. In this example, I'm formatting a simple record data, taking the values and putting it into a format that's easy to read. I can do the same data and format it into a name value pair list as well. So now, finally, this kind of blending the newer features and more data capturing in the Studio version, along with the getting to the multiple loggers. And so this is an example. On this page is a calculator, and it's broken up into different pieces. I have functions for each of the button clicks that respond to the numbers, and it builds up an expression. And the expression, there's a class that will parse that and figure out the actual value. So as I go through and type in 6 times 5, you can see that my log has changed a little bit, and it's faded, it's a little washed out, but there's a different background color that's being used in these. You can see it a little bit. And there's also a value inside the category column now. I'm using a separate logger to capture the data for the numerical input. And so I can see that, okay, the numbers button was clicked, the 6 cell was clicked, and I'm building up my formula as I go through. And so I can highlight that information. Once I go back and click the equal, I'm now seeing, oh, okay, well, inside the equals click, here's my resulting formula. I'm now parsing that with the expression, and I've passed that to it, and now I see my result is 30. I have a different color coding going on here, which is very ugly on the screen. It's nice orangey here. But the key thing is I've got another category that's being used. Every category, including the CodeSite logger that you can have, you can enable and disable on demand through the enabled property. So as I've gone through here, if I turn off the calculator logger, I just said enabled to false, I can go through and do another calculation. I can clear it. Nothing's adding to the window. I do 4 times 9. I still haven't added any new information to it until I click equal. Now the expression logger is still active, and it's going to send data to it. This is an example. I've got different message types. I'm sending, enter and exit methods plus the data values. It doesn't matter. By categorizing it, I can control what areas I'm more interested in seeing. Well, that's great if I've set up the categories and I've turned them on or off in my application. And I could do that dynamically. I could have a settings to do it, registry entries, config files, whatever you'd want to use. Well, what if I don't have that? I've got all this category data, but I'm only interested in a certain area. Well, going back to the viewer, I can go in here and create a new view. I can say, let me see just the calculator category of items, and click the new view, and now I have a new calculator tab that shows me just, the calculator messages that are there. You can always have access to the full log of data that's available, and so we can switch between the two. What's also nice is I can actually pick a message somewhere in my view and sync that between the views. So a lot of times we see interactions. I'm like, oh, this is the message I'm interested in. I've filtered it. Well, now where does that occur in the grand scheme of things? By syncing up the message and switching to the other view, it actually goes to that location, and it will jump back and forth for you as needed. And you can just toggle that off and so forth. Another nice thing to be able to do is I'll delete that view, and we have the message organizer, which allows you to automatically build views based on the data you have already captured. So if I go into Let me get my view here. So I want to organize the messages by category, click OK, and it automatically figures out that, oh, I need a calculator and an expression category. And so it figures that all for you. Now let me, and so that's the value of multiple loggers to isolate that. Now let me go through and show another example. Let me close out this. I'm going to close off my extra views, and I'll bring that back in just a second. I want to go to my test apps real here. How are we doing? Oh, we're doing good. Good. Test apps, Delphi, threading. This is a fun little app. The threading demo's inside of Delphi, and if you've ever had to take a look at it, it's kind of cool. I've modified it a little bit to emphasize some CodeSite functionality. I've color-coded each of the sorting routines, and it's going to match to things I show up inside the view. Each sort function that's inside of here has a single statement for CodeSite that describes the swap. So whenever one of the sorting routines swaps two entries in the list, it sends it to CodeSite. So the end result is actually pretty cool. So let me go and bring up the viewer here. And I go ahead and start sorting, and I can move things around. Everything's there. I've got auto scroll, so it's filling all the data, but I'll turn that off to rip through all the data. What's nice, this is where the CodeSite dispatcher really shows some value. Your app is not the one that's sending it to the viewer or writing it to the log file. We really don't want to have your app spending time trying to buffer out to the file or figure out the endpoint and so forth. We just capture the data and send it off to someone else, and that's what the dispatcher does. So not only you can have multiple threads do this, but you can have multiple instances. I could run 4 or 5 different versions of the CodeSite demo, run them all to sort. They're all going to route their messages to the dispatcher, which queues them up, sends control back to your app, which is why I could go and move it around even though it was still logging, and then go back and look at the log to see what was captured. So doing that, if I go back, I find this fascinating just from how the systems work, because the color coding tells me which sort routine was being used. And so instead of showing the category, because I'm just using CodeSite to send it, let me see the thread. And I'll show up the thread, and so I can see that this is the way the system was actually swapping through. Now, I've got indentions here because, oh, well, they're all independent. The bubble sort is not really being called by the quick sort. It's just that they were recorded one right after the other, and they're different threads. Well, wouldn't it be nice? We should see this in different threads. So let's go ahead and auto-organize this into the different threads that we have. And now what we can see is, let's take the bubble sort, for example, and we have the start of the bubble sort. We can go to the end, and we can see that that took 3,300 swaps to do the bubble sort out of the 4,500 that we have total. I can also see how long it took me to run a particular item. If I select any 2 messages, it tells me the time difference between those. And so if I do that and click the 2, I have 2 selected, it took 4.5 seconds to do the bubble sort. It's kind of lousy. Well, let's take a look at the quick sort. That's the selection sort's the middle one. I have the same thing. I can jump to the beginning and end. I have the right structure. That took a lot less time. Only 980 swaps. Do the same thing for the quick sort. I'm doing it in 227, 225 if I get rid of the enter and exit methods. And so I can jump to the end. So just by capturing one line of code in each thread class, I've got some really valuable data of what I can see. All right. Let me switch back to this. And a couple things I want to show real quick. I'll do the remote one. I'm going to skip around just a little bit. One of the things that we can also do is the remote capability. And so what is that? I'm going to keep this in here. I'm just going to set that to false. We'll send it locally as well. That's fine. And in the Studio version, I can send my CodeSite data using TCP or UDP or HTTP or a variety of different ways. But I'm going to just use a straight TCP one. So I want to set active to true. And I need to tell where I need to send it to. So I need to set up the host. And the host is going to be 10 to 11, 55.28. It could be named if you have names on your destinations. Just because of the net here and where I'm running, I've got another machine, Windows machine that I'm running. Its IP address is what I just figured. I wrote that down, so I don't have to look it up. I have the dispatcher running on the remote machine, and the dispatcher has a bunch of options on it that allows me to, what ports am I monitoring, and if they're, what named value paths I want to use, and so forth. And all of that's documented inside the CodeSite help. But all I want to do right now is I want to get some messages over here from my other machine. So I'm going to set up the host. The default destination is still the viewer on the other side. So let me go ahead and run this. 211. And so I generate my data, and if I switch over to here, I've got my remote data. The dispatcher does all the work for you. I literally 2 lines of code, and I've got it on another machine. I can also do the same thing to a log file on that other machine. And so the way we can do that is you set up the destination, the TCP, and then there's a property called remote destination string. And you can set this to be a coded value string of where it's going to go. It can be all nested and so forth, and you're probably going, well, how do I create this destination string? Inside the CodeSite product, if you go into the tools, you go into the bin, there is a destination string builder. And go ahead and run that, and then you can pick out, I want it to go here, I want it to use the my docs directory for logs, and you give it a file name, and new sample. Some other things that you can do is you can set up the maximum size of the log file in K. So maybe you want it just to be 256K, no bigger. And we want to keep track of multiple parts. So let's say we're going to keep track of 4 of those, and we want to, basically we're storing a meg of data. The last part that gets filled up gets deleted, and we just keep having the most 4 files recently used. You can set that to be bigger and so forth. This is your destination string that you would set into the remote destination strings, and it'll do that on the remote side. Lots of capabilities in there. All right, so let me come back, close this down. I'll save it off, that's fine. Let me create a new app real quick, and I'm going to drop a bunch of, just drop a bunch of different controls down. Oh, there's my edits. I was looking for those. This is the Raise Components product, by the way, but that's a different talk. And I'm just dropping some things down, and I want to create a bunch of quick event handlers. Because one of the other very powerful features inside of CodeSite Studio is the ability to automatically trace and insert trace statements into our code. We want to see what happens. So we could type in everything. CodeSite Studio also has the ability to do a trace method. And trace method is you give it the name of the method, and you don't have to do the exit. It automatically does an enter and exit method for you. So each time you go through, so it's very powerful. It's a nice way to do it, but it's just in the Studio version. It's a new thing we added for 5. It's been around in an add-on that developers have written, and we've modified it to fit to the level we wanted it to go. But if you go to the Tools menu and pull up the CodeSite Method Tracer, it actually gives you a structure view of your unit. And from here, you can pick what methods you want to actually trace. And you can determine how you want to trace them. Do you want to use the trace method that's new? Do you want to use enter and exit method pairs? What logger do you want to use to do it? Setting up the spacing and so forth. So I'm going to go ahead and process all of that. And it's going to add in trace statements for me. Now what's nice is I can go back into the same tool, into the method tracer, and take off certain ones. Or I'll say, you know, I want to do add timings to each of the calls. So I'll go ahead and process those. And this adds this TMO timing parameter to the method call, which will record how long that method took to execute inside of the log view, or the live viewer when we record it. So really nice, powerful way to see some of that data. All right, Kind of got quick there at the end, but had a lot of stuff to cover. I've touched on most of these. There's a couple extra things that I didn't get to, like variant support and so forth, the various different structures. The trace method, I showed the high precision timer, which is part of that. So you can do actually very high precise timings. You can start, there's a timer property that you can start and stop inside of all of your loggers. So you can do codesite.timer.start. When you do the stop, it'll actually send out a message with the how long it took that section of code to run. You can compress the message data that's getting sent over the wire. You can compress it into the log files to save some space. I showed the remote destinations. Oh, file logging by date is actually very cool. That if you set that property to true, the log file name that you get automatically gets appended with the current date. You can also specify the format. So if you want to do year, month, day, or day, month, year, you can do that however you would want. There's an event in the process. A lot of times we get asked, well, I want to do something special if my CodeSite logger captures an error message. You know, I'd love to be able to send an email message to my help desk to be able to know that something happened. Well, one way to do that is to handle the onSend message event. You get the full message data that shows up in the viewer, but you can get to it in your code. So you can check the message type that it's an error and then do something with it. You could send the data via email, use the Indy components, write it to a database. It's up to you. We also have event log support. Now, writing to the event log, your Windows event log, it's not a destination. You don't want to fill it with all your logging data, but writing things to the event log is very valuable. It's a little complicated, though. We make a simple function call to do it. You can log an event, an error, and a warning to your event log. Very nice way to do that. So if you have monitoring, site scope, other tools like that that can do remote monitoring of a system's event log, another way to trigger support mechanisms. Scratchpad, oh, I actually should show this real quick. Let me pull up my demo. This is the next piece here. And pull up my viewer. A lot of times when we do data or development, we've got a lot of data that makes sense to be in the view, the message list, but there's other data that we really only care about the last value that's there. So doing mouse move operations, bounding rectangles, position changes, and that's where the scratchpad comes into play. As I update it, it flashes. Of course, I can delete an entry, I can clear it, and it just figures out how to rebuild the list whenever you write to it. So it's like a runtime watch window. Very effective. I don't need to fill my log. My log can actually have the criteria that I'm using for the processing. What output I have shows up there. All right, so let me go back to this. Method tracer, I showed that. I showed all of those. We are offering a special promotion. If you go to our ordering website, if you're interested in getting this, we take $100 off the list price. CodeSite Express comes with RAD Studio, as I mentioned before. The Studio version's regular price is $399. That is a developer license. That is for the license for all the logging classes, the code that you link into your executables. You would get all of the logging class support. So for Delphi, C++ Builder, the FireMonkey parts in there, the VCL, .NET support is also included. So we don't separate what platforms we support. It's all in one. And so we're offering the discount on that. The tools, the dispatcher, the viewer are all redistributable. I don't think I mentioned it. The dispatcher can be run silently in the background. It doesn't have to have the icon on the desktop. Actually, the default is to not show it, so it's just running in the background. You can run it as a service. There's a variety of ways to do all of that. And then if you're interested in any of our other products, I'll be over at the Ray Software booth. I'd be happy to show more about Ray's components, for example, and our others, and we've got discounts for all of that. So does anybody have any questions? That's awesome. If you do have any, I said I'm going to be here the rest of the day. I've got a few more sessions. Stop by. I'd be happy to talk more details. And if after the conference, feel free to email me. I'd be happy to help you out.
One question.
Yes? Yes, We don't do anything to do that automatically, to put it into a database, just because who knows what database you're using, and we don't try to figure that out for you. But we do give you an event to hook into that. And so if I were to go back to my IDE here, and in the form create, for example, in my logger, I can do CodeSite dot and then on, and then I'm going to pull up my on-send message, and I can do CodeSite message handler, and the help describes what to do in that, and then there's parameters that come to that event handler. One's called message data, and it gives you all of the pieces that CodeSite has captured. So you actually get it after all the loggers done the work of getting all the data. There's also a parameter to the event handler called handled. So if you're going to handle it completely yourself, store it to a database, for example, you don't have to let it go on to the dispatcher or anything else for that matter. You can just say, hey, I've done what it needs to be do.
And this feature is also in the base version of CodeSite?
The event is only in the studio version. We have to give you something compelling to get to the product so we can continue to do more things with it. But yeah, the event is one that is in the studio version only. You're welcome. All right, thank you very much. Oh, one more.
English a little. If there is an exception in an application, how can you trace in CodeSite?
So the way an exception comes up, let me go to, do I still have it running? It's a great question because we often get that. And did I not? Oh, I don't have it in there. Oh, I'll build one. It's easy enough to build one. There's a couple different ways to do that. One of the things that you can do is, for example, we recommend doing application dot on exception and set that to CodeSite dot, and it should show up in here, exception, come on. My code insight's not working. You set it up to an exception handler. So as an exception gets raised, the exception data gets automatically put into the logger that you see. And so we don't require any map files or any debug information with your code, but you do, if you've traced methods, you'll see where the exception was raised and what the data was. We do have some developers that like using tools like exception magic or log accept and other things like that to get the extra data for the stack frames and so forth. And then they log that to CodeSite to see it in the grand scheme of things for that. But there is support for all the exceptions. There's an exception message message type that will show up. So they will show up with the exclamation point rather than an error message inside of there. I have to add that back into my message generator. We used to have an example that did exactly that. It raised an exception so you would see it, and I'm running out of time. So stop by the booth and I would be happy to show that in action. But I'm done. Thank you very much for coming.